I've mentioned that I've met several people who vowed that they were going to read the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and they started with deep resolution and read through the book of Genesis and then sailed through the book of Exodus. But once they hit the book of Leviticus, they began to lose some of their zeal for their reading through the Bible, and many drop out in the middle of the book of Leviticus. Some endure Leviticus and make it to the book of Numbers, and then they fold their tents and go home. And it is a rare few that read all the way through the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the reason for that is simple, and that is that in Genesis and Exodus we have historical material with which we're at least vaguely familiar, and there's a lot of action and interest in the information that's found therein. But as soon as we get to Leviticus, we encounter information and material in the Bible that in many respects is completely foreign to us. Because the book of Leviticus contains long and detailed discussions of specific rules and regulation for the behavior of the people in the celebration of religion within Israel. There are detailed descriptions of how a person can discern the difference between a normal, harmless skin rash and the discerning of leprosy. And people get bogged down in this because it's so foreign. That's why I often recommend to people in their maiden voyage through Scripture that they read a quick overview of the historical books first and then go back and fill in the gaps with these more difficult pieces of literature. And that's what we're trying to do in this introductory survey of the Old Testament, to provide you with the overview of a framework or the structure of the whole of Scripture, and then hope that you will go back and read the individual chapters and verses of each book of the Bible. And I have to say this, as much as we may struggle initially with books like Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, those three books of the Pentateuch are a virtual storehouse of wealth of detailed information that has profound meaning for our understanding of the New Testament, and we'll often miss it the first time through because we don't have that basic structure in which to place the details of these books. But the book of Leviticus is called Leviticus in the history of the church because it gives all of the rules and regulations for the activities of the tribe of Levi. It was the tribe of Levi from which the priesthood was established in the Old Testament. Aaron and his descendants were called to serve in what we call the cultus of Israel. Now, I'm almost afraid to use that word at all in the course of these lectures, because as soon as we hear that word cultus, it conjures up in our minds the idea of something dreadful, namely of a cult. We think of cults as being these extreme, radical fringe sects that are involved in things like Jonestown and the like. But this is really a technical term that describes the life and activity of any religious community. And Israel has an elaborately established cultus, that is, religious community. And it does not carry the negative connotation that the word cult does. But the book of Leviticus is very much concerned with Levitical principles and what we call ritual law. And it's because the rituals of the Old Testament are so strange and foreign to us that we sometimes become bored or intimidated by the material found in the book of Leviticus. But if we stop for a moment and remember that every ritual, that is, every rite that God instituted among His people in the Old Testament, had some significance that points beyond itself to the fulfillment of redemption that comes to pass in the person and work of Christ. So as we look carefully and minutely at some of these detailed rituals of the Old Testament, there's a sense in which they just open up for our understanding the depth and the riches of what we find in the New Testament. The book of Numbers is called by that name because it's basically concerned with the numbering of the tribes and their situation and apportionment to the various places that they would occupy in the Promised Land. And the book of Deuteronomy, the prefix deutero means second, and the Greek word nomos means law. And so the book of Deuteronomy simply refers to the second book of the law, which in a sense is a recapitulation of all of the law that we find in, particularly in Exodus and later on in the other books of the Pentateuch. But what we're going to do today is look chiefly at the significance of the book of Leviticus for the Old Testament priesthood. If there is one overarching theme that we find in Leviticus, it is the theme of holiness. It is the theme of the holiness of God as it is to be manifested in the rituals and in the behavioral patterns of the people that he has called to himself, saying to them, "Be ye holy, even as I am holy." And so all of these rites and laws that govern the cultic life of Israel are concerned about maintaining the holiness of the nation. And it begins really earlier in Exodus with the institution and ordination of the priesthood. Because in the first instance, the fundamental purpose of the priest in the Old Testament was to be God's minister of the holy. Now, one of my favorite passages that illustrates this in the Old Testament is found in the 10th chapter of the book of Leviticus. It's one of those dramatic incidents that are recorded there, but sheds enormous light on the significance and the role of the Levitical priesthood. It tells the story of Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron. Chapter 10 of Leviticus begins as follows. Then Nadab and Abihu, some call him Abihu, but I'm going to call him Abihu. Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And so fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Now, these two verses give us a succinct, terse, summary description of what happens. I mean, this is so characteristic of the Old Testament to just sort of skim over lightly profoundly important events and almost make them appear as postscripts to Old Testament history. But certainly for Aaron, this was a dramatic moment in his life because his two sons, who were following in his footsteps, who had been ordained and consecrated to the priesthood, came before the altar and offered what the Bible calls strange fire. That is, these young priests were experimenting with certain innovations in the process of worship that had not been consecrated or prescribed by God. And on the surface, it looks like a harmless type of thing. But God's response to their innovation and their changing of the divinely ordained mode of worship was to kill them instantly. Now let's read what happens as a result. And Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy. And before all the people, I must be glorified." So Aaron held his peace. Allow me the liberty and license for a moment to read between the lines here. When Aaron discovers that his sons have been killed instantly by the God they were consecrated to serve, and the God Aaron is giving his life in dedication to, he must not only have been profoundly grieved by the death of his sons, but he must have been totally bewildered and upset that God would do this. And many of us today, when we read stories like this in the Old Testament, are offended by them. What kind of a God would summarily execute priests for what seems to be such a small and insignificant thing? And I can hear Aaron rushing to the tent of Moses, because after all, Aaron, even though he's consecrated as the high priest and the chief priest of Israel, is still not the leader of Israel. The leader of Israel at this time in history remains Moses. He is the mediator of the Old Covenant, and the leadership authority has been invested in him. And so Aaron goes straight to Moses, and I am assuming that what he's doing is he's saying, "What is God doing here? Moses, you need to talk to God. Protest this unjust manifestation of